Coming up, thinking rationally and behaving ethically.
I think of myself like a social engineer. People have lots of interests. My interest is the things that we do wrong that we should fix.
Duke professor Dan Ariely discusses behavioral economics and what beer and vinegar have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
As one of the world's leading behavioral economists, Dan Ariely has taken direct aim at conventional economic theory. He argues not only that our decisions are often irrational, but that they're predictably irrational. Dan Ariely is the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economy at Duke University. He has not one, but 2 PhDs under his belt, and is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, Predictably Irrational and The Upside of Rationality, as well as his latest release, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. So we'll begin with the term behavioral economics. Can you give us a little bit of an intro into what that means?
Yeah, so if you think about standard economics has a very descriptive way of thinking about human nature. It starts with some assumptions about people behaving rationally. And the idea of rationally is that we can think about all the possibilities, we consider everything across time, we have no emotion, no interference. It's as if we had a supercomputer in our mind and we had access to all the information. And based on that, we compute and execute our decisions. And behavioral economics basically said, let's not make these assumptions. Instead, let's put people in different situations and let's see how they behave. And it turns out when you try and see how people behave, it doesn't work that well.
So you, in fact, argue that we're irrational.
In many ways.
And is there then variation in your data? So are women, say, less rational or more rational than men?
So it's interesting because there's a huge gender difference. And the gender difference is that only women think that they are more rational than men. but in our experiments, we almost never find any gender differences.
Right. So how did you stumble upon this idea of rationality, and how did you get interested in this notion of decision making?
So my personal story is I was badly injured many years ago. I got burned in 70% of my body, and I spent about 3 years in hospital. And hospital is a place where you can observe lots and lots of irrational behaviors. And I got lots of my interest in from that perspective, but the thing that troubled me the most was the question of bandage removal. So imagine you were a burn patient and you were covered with burns and somebody had to take the bandages off. And now the question is, what's the ideal way to take it off? Should you rip the bandages off quickly, minimize the duration but having it very, very painful? Or should you stretch it over a long time, every second not as painful but take a large amount of time? And most people think that the ripping approach is better. And my nurses believed that, actually strongly. They held the belief that this was the right thing to do. And when I left the hospital, I started doing experiments in pain. So I would bring people to the lab and I would crunch their fingers a little bit. I did experiments with electrical shocks and heat and all kinds of things. And I found that it's the wrong answer. It turns out that if you take a painful experience and you make it twice as long, you don't make it twice as painful. You play with the amplitude, now you dramatically change how people experience it. The nurses were trying to shrink the duration. In fact, they should have tried to shrink the intensity. And the question is, how could they get it wrong? Here were good, wonderful, kind people spending their life to help patients, and they were getting things wrong. And it was not that some were doing it too fast and some were doing it too slow. They were getting it wrong in a systematic way. Because we're good people, we never want to go against our intuition.
So you go through this very treacherous and long recovery process. It takes many, many years. But you stumble upon this idea that humans might be irrational, and you opt to, in some ways, dedicate your career to this. Why? So what's so important about this idea?
So I think of myself like a social engineer, right? People have lots of interests. My interest is the things that we do wrong that we should fix. Right? So I think back to my own life, and I think about all the things that people did wrong in hospital and the ways that we should fix it. Now I see things wrong in all kinds of ways. And every time we do something wrong, it's a shame. And this is actually one of the biggest differences between standard economics and behavioral economics. If you think that people are perfectly rational, it just means push information out there, people would have all the information, they'll make the right decisions. If you think that people are making systematic mistakes, then the question is, so what kind of regulation, what kind of rules, what kind of improvement do you want to suggest? So I really want to figure out what mistakes do we make and how do we overcome them.
Mm-hmm. And within that vein, you do a lot of work on ethics and honesty. You say that if you look historically, you can argue, when you look at professional honesty in particular, that it's on the decline. And you cite cases like Enron. So can you talk a little bit?
I think there's a couple of reasons why ethics is on a decline. And it's not because the young generation is less moral than the old generation. One of the things we find is that when people have a hesitation of doing an immoral act directly, but it's much easier for us to do it indirectly. In our experiments, we tempt people to steal money from us. And the way we do it is we give people a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems, and we say, solve as many of those as you can in 5 minutes, we'll give you $1 per question. If you're in the experiment, I would pass the sheets around, I would say, go. You would work as fast as you can. At the end of the 5 minutes, I would say, stop, count how many questions you got correctly. Now take the sheet of paper and go to the back of the room and shred it. And then come back and tell me how many questions you got correctly. I'll pay you accordingly. People do that. They said they solved 6 problems. We pay them $6. They go home. What the people in the experiment don't know is that we played with a shredder. So the shredder only shred the sides of the page, but the main body of the page remains intact. And we can go in and we can find out how many questions people really solve correctly. And what do we find? On average, people report 6, but they solve 4. And by the way, it's not as if we have a few big cheaters who kind of shift the mean. We have a ton of little cheaters. Just to give you kind of an estimation, in many experiments, we ran about 30,000 people. And from those 30,000 people, we had about 12 big cheaters. And together, they stole about $150 from me. We also had about 18,000 little cheaters. And together, they stole about $36,000 from me. So just kind of to give you a sense of the importance of big cheaters versus small cheaters. Now, here's the thing about distance. Imagine you were in the experiment. In one condition, you finished, you shred, you come and you say, you look at the experimenter in the eyes and you say, I solved X problems, give me X dollars. In the other experiment, you look at them in the eyes and you say, I solved X problems, give me X tokens. And we pay people in tokens. Now they take these tokens, they walk 12 feet to the side and change them for dollars. It's all about money, but when you lie and look into someone in the eye, you lie for something that is one step removed from money. What happened? Our participants doubled their cheating. Right? For me, this is an incredibly worrisome result because if you think about it, we're moving to a society with great distances. Moving from cash to credit cards to electronic wallet, from cash to stock options. We're dealing with people directly to dealing over great distances. So I think one of the things that is happening is that with this great distance of dealing with other people, it's easier for us to be dishonest but think of ourselves as good people. That's one thing. The second thing is that we take a big clue about what is okay and not okay from other people around us. So imagine the following experiment. You're in the experiment, and we do everything in the same way with 2 changes. One is we give you an envelope with all the money up front. Say, this is all the money for the experiment. And when you finish, give us back the money you did not make and keep the rest. The second change is that we hire an acting student. And that acting student sits in the front row, and 30 seconds into the experiment, they raise their hand, and they say, I solved everything, what do I do? Now, if you're in the experiment, you're still working on problem 1. There is no question this person is lying, and the experiment is saying, you solved everything, you're free to go. And you see that person taking all their money and going home. What would happen to your morality? Lots of people cheat more. But you could say why? There could be 2 reasons. One is that we just proved to you that in this experiment, you can cheat and get away with it. Here's the proof. Somebody cheated. I'm not pointing on you for any reason. Somebody cheated, got away with it. Nobody chased them. There were no repercussions. Maybe you could just do it. The other possibility is that it's not about getting away with it. It's about the fact that it's kind of socially acceptable. Nobody stood up. Nobody did anything. Somebody from your group did it. So to look into this, we changed the outfit of the acting student. And here's what we did. We ran this experiment at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. Everybody was a Carnegie Mellon student. The acting student was a Carnegie Mellon student. In the second condition, he was wearing University of Pittsburgh sweatshirt. Now, what happens if you're a University of Carnegie Mellon student and you see University of Pittsburgh cheats? You still learn from the cost-benefit analysis that you can get away with it, but it doesn't give you the social proof. It doesn't tell you that people like you are doing that. And what happened now? When the University of Pittsburgh student cheats, cheating actually goes down. So this suggests that we learn from other people around us what is acceptable and not acceptable. And you can think about all kinds of things in politics and on Wall Street and doping in sports. We know what's legal and illegal, but what's really driving our behavior is what are the people around us that we associate with do. And every time one person kind of chooses away from the moral path, the whole group can change. And I think we see this kind of a progression.
So if you're a policymaker and you're working on something like dealing with financial regulations on Wall Street, what do you advise?
So the first thing is to realize what not to do. So what do policymakers think? Policymaker thinks that people weigh the cost and benefit. Is this a worthwhile crime? Is it or not? What's the punishment? Should I do it or not? And because of that, with this kind of thinking, you could say, let's just have big punishments. And as long as we have big punishments, nobody would commit a crime. For example, think about something really big, like the death penalty. You would say, if you have the death penalty, nobody would ever commit a crime. Guess what? In the US, we have states that have the death penalty and states that don't. And you think there's a difference in crime rates? We can't observe any difference. California, 3 strikes and you're out, right? You can steal 3 slices of pizza, one after the other, and go to jail for life. You would say nobody would ever commit a third crime. Not so. Now, in our experiments, when we do things, we also don't find much evidence that people think about the cost-benefit analysis. So the first thing to do is if you think about life, you say there's education, there's the moment of temptation, and there's future. Policy is focusing only on the future. Let's create big punishments. And as long as these punishments are big, nobody would behave badly. I think we need to focus much more on education, which is morality. And we need to think about how do we get people not to feel comfortable cheating at the moment, not to be able to rationalize it, right? What do we do at the moment? How do we create standard of ethics? Every time we create fuzzy boundaries in which lots of behaviors are possible, people are going to read that in a way that is selfishly good for them at the moment, but not necessarily for the long term.
One of the, I think, most depressing findings that you write about is that people opt not to intervene in cases of mass tragedies as the number of victims arise. Yeah. And I think that has important implications for a group like the Carnegie Council that's working to get people to intervene in cases that, of large-scale atrocity. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is something called the identifiable victim effect. And again, you can have the sad part and the good part. And the sad part is that we are really not moved emotionally by large tragedy. The good side is that we are moved by cases of individuals. So there's lots of examples like this, but think about the following illustration. Imagine you're walking over a bridge, and you're walking for a job interview, and it's your dream job interview. You always wanted to get this job. Your interview starts in 15 minutes. And you have a new suit and a new tie and new socks and new you're just ready for the job interview. And as you walk over the bridge, you hear a cry of a baby. And you look over and you see a baby about to drown. And if you jump, you could save the baby. And if you don't jump, and you can't get your clothes off, right? And if you jump with all your clothes, the job interview is over. How many people would consider this and say, well, it's one baby. If I go and get the job, I might get a really good salary. I could give half of it to charity. This would clearly save many more babies than this one baby. I could contribute to malaria. This would be really effective. Really hard to think this way, right? So this is a case where the reality is that we will jump, we will risk our career, lose a lot of money, the suit and so on, to save a baby. There are babies who die every day that we could save for very little money. But when we see a tragedy of an individual, our hearts start working, we feel terrible, and we come to help. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's all kinds of things that basically mute our emotions. And one of them is the size of the tragedy. So you would think that if I would describe to you a poor girl in Africa who's suffering and starving, your heart would go out to her and you would want to help her. And if I describe 10,000 of those, your heart would go out 10,000 times more. Sadly not. As the tragedy becomes larger, we actually start thinking more rationally rather than emotionally, and we help less. Right? And that's a real question, because we have these incredible tragedies happening all the time. And until a case of an individual comes up in which we can tie our emotion to it, we just don't care enough and don't do much about it.
Mm-hmm. And you've also written about conflict resolution, and you've spoken to organizations to talk about the role of behavioral economy in conflict resolution. And I love this experiment you use with beer and vinegar. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In this experiment, we did the following. Imagine I gave you a choice, and I gave you a glass of beer with vinegar and a glass of beer without vinegar. I said, try them both and tell me which one you like more, which one you would like a big glass of. And people try it, and they say, I hate the one with the vinegar, give me the regular one. Well, you would expect. Other people, we say, try 2 glasses. We don't tell them one has vinegar and one doesn't. And then we say, which one do you like now? And turns out most people like the one with vinegar. Now here's the thing. It turns out in a blind taste, vinegar, by the way, balsamic vinegar, we can give you the exact recipe. Balsamic vinegar does make beer better. But when you think it will make it worse, it actually makes it worse. So if you think about it in a bigger scheme, what this suggests is that our preconceptions about reality actually influence the way we interpret reality. Right? And you know, in a very sad way, I think this is kind of the experience of, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every time something bad happens in the Middle East, everybody sees it from their own perspective. There's no way for people to see it in an objective way. The Israelis see the explosion from their perspective, the Palestinians see it from their perspective, and what we see is that any one of those events just pull the two sides further apart. And if you think about this, if you think about the fact that your preconceived notions are coloring your experience, one approach to try to fix it is to try to eliminate preconceived notions. So for example, one of the experiments we've been trying to do is we've been trying to get Israelis and Palestinians to play games online without knowing who the other person is. Right? So can we create trust? So if I know you're Palestinian and I'm Israeli and so on, there's a good chance that our knowledge about each other would paint the way we think about each other and will not let trust emerge. Can we think about electronic media? Can we think about getting people together before they know about the vinegar, in a sense? And so far we have at least some suggesting evidence that this is a good direction.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that policymakers are open to those suggestions?
You know what? I think we had the best success so far with policymaker in how to get more taxes out of people. The rest of it, I think, is going to be a little slower. But I'm still hopeful. The British government, in the last election, opened an office for behavioral economics, and they're doing all kinds of experiments with the British citizens. The US government has done some things. I'm going to talk to the Dutch central bank. There is movement, and I'm hopeful. You know, academics are used to everything being very slow. So in academic speed, this is quite good.
Have you done any tests to see whether people who claim to be religious are more likely to be honest as compared to atheists?
There's a story in the Bible that God comes to Sarah and said, Sarah, you're going to have a son. And Sarah laughs. And she said, how can I have a son when my husband is so old? God said, don't worry. Then God goes to Abraham and said, Abraham, you're going to have a son. And Abraham says, did you tell Sarah? And God said, yes. This is my, reenactment of the Bible. It's not exactly like this. And Abraham said, and what did Sarah say? And God said, Sarah said, how could she have a son when she is so old? And the religious scholars have wondered, how could God lie? And the conclusion is that it's okay to lie for peace at home. Shlom bayit in Hebrew. And if you think about it, I talked to quite a few religious leaders about this, and one of their realization is that there are many human values. Honesty is one of them. But human values happen to collide from time to time. Not all human values are compatible all the time. And what do you do when they collide? So that's kind of something that religion has, there's some thoughts at least about that. The other thing I'll tell you about religion, we've done some experiments on this. The lead to the experiment was the following. There's a little joke. A guy goes to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, you wouldn't believe what happened. Somebody stole my bicycle from synagogue." And the rabbi is appalled. He said, "Somebody's stealing your bicycle from synagogue? This is terrible. This is awful. I can't believe this is happening. Here is what you do. Come to synagogue next week and sit in the front row. And as we go over the 10 Commandments, turn around and look at everybody in the eyes. And when we get to thou shalt not steal, see who can't look you straight in the eyes, you'll know that's your thief." The guy is very excited, comes to synagogue, sits in the front row, turns around, doing 10 Commandments. At the end of the services, he goes to the rabbi. He said, "Rabbi, you wouldn't believe it. It worked like magic. It worked like a charm. The moment we got to thou shalt not commit adultery, I remembered where I left my bike." Now, where's the experiment? We went to UCLA, and we asked 500 undergrads to try and recall the 10 Commandments. None of them could recall all 10 Commandments. They invented lots of interesting new ones. But what happened after they just tried to recall the 10 Commandments? We tempted them to cheat in the same task I described earlier. Nobody cheated. Right? And it wasn't the people who remembered more commandments didn't cheat, and the people who can't remember any commandments, the non-religious people, cheated a lot. It was across the board. In fact, even when we take self-declared atheists and we get them to swear on the Bible, they stop cheating. If you think about religion, I think that religion has a couple of elements within it. One element is heaven and hell, right? Something in the long term. I don't think that matters. I don't think we have any evidence of any human activity that is driven toward that long term. But I think that religion do give you lots of do and don't do rules for the daily lives. And I think these rules are actually helpful. This is why I think that being spiritual is not enough. Right? I think that actually having specific rules for behavior help people regulate their approach.
When you're talking about things like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or maybe the current political climate that we have here in the US, where there's such divide between the two parties, there isn't much room there for a third-party intervention or mediator. How do we address these as a practical matter?
Well, there was a philosopher called John Rawls. And John Rawls asked the question of what's a just society? And he came to the conclusion that a just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you'll be willing to enter it in a random place. And he called this the veil of ignorance. And it's an interesting way to think about society, right? If you think about wealth distribution, you say some people are wealthy, some are not. If you're very poor, you might want society to be more equal. If you're very rich, you might want society to be very unequal. But if you don't know where you'll end up, and it could be random, it will be random, you have to consider all possibilities. So this was his version of a social justice and what's called the veil of ignorance. So we asked almost 30,000 Americans to describe to us what would be a distribution of wealth such that they would be willing to enter it in a random place. We did it in many ways. Imagine we took the US, divided to 5 buckets, the top 20%, the next 20%, the next, the next, and the next. How much of the total wealth of 100% do you think is owned by the bottom 40%? 0.3%, right? The distribution, we have what's called the Gini coefficient. We have a very unequal distribution of wealth in this country. Okay, so first of all, we have a very unequal distribution of wealth. When you ask people what it is, they don't understand what it is. But when we ask people to tell us what they think it should be in the Rawls world, it's much more even. Right? In fact, when we show people a distribution of wealth that is more equal than Sweden, a distribution of wealth that is the US, and we say, under the veil of ignorance, which one would you rather live in? 92% of Americans choose the one that is more equal than Sweden. Now, going back to your question, when we break this by Republicans and Democrats, There's almost no difference. So when you ask this question, in general, 92% prefer they're more equal than Sweden. For Democrats, it's 93%. For Republicans, it's 91%. Different, but tiny differences. And I think this is exactly the beer and vinegar, right? What happened is that when you think about the Rawls constraint, you think in abstract terms of what's a just society. You're not taking your current position into account. In fact, that's what the Rawls constraint does. It says, you don't know where you'll end up. So I think that these kind of exercises, where we basically just get to think about what we think is a just society, where we would like to live. I'm not saying somebody will go through this and choose for a different party, but I think that the moment you get to kind of confront your ideas about what you think is right and wrong, without being colored by your own position, I think people would come up to become much, much more similar. In our experiments, we don't find difference in Republicans and Democrats, rich and poor. I mean, men and women, tiny differences, but really insignificant. The reality is that I think if you strip down and you talked about what we consider justice, we would be much more similar, not perfect similar, much more similar than the current political system would have you believe. So that's my good news.
Dan Ariely, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a fascinating discussion.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.